So let me take this opportunity to welcome you to, I think it's the fourth event of the Jerusalem Salon, where we discuss interesting and intellectual topics on the day and how Judaism and public policy and intellectual ideas intersect. So we invited Rabbi Bar-Hayim, who I met about a year ago, to speak. And Rabbi Bar-Hayim is the head of Machon Shilo. He is a Torah visionary and a scholar. He has proposed reestablishment of Minhag Eretz Yisrael based on pre-exile Jewish customs rather than customs based in Europe or in Bavli, and has published a Sidur to reflect the Nusach Tefillah of the Talmud Yerushalmi, Nusach Eretz Yisrael. In addition, in 2007, Rabbi Bar-Hayim issued a psak that Ashkenazim living in Israel may eat kitniot on Pesach. We'd like to also wish Rabbi Bar-Hayim Mazel Tov on his recent marriage.
Mazel Tov.
Let me begin with a question, which has been asked, many times. Why do we consider ourselves bound, at least Orthodox Jews, consider themselves bound to Halacha? Or put another way, what is Halacha? Another way of, yet a third way of putting that question is, why do we listen to Chazal as opposed to those who came after? In other words, why is there a cutoff point? All these questions need to be clarified before we really can delve into other matters. If you look at the introduction of Rambam to his Mishneh Torah, to his famous code of Halacha, one finds that Rambam goes to great lengths to explain that the Halacha that we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud, etc., is something that was both passed down and developed over many generations. And he goes through all the generations from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way to the end of the Talmud. And in fact, he does it twice. He does it forwards and backwards. He lists the generations from Moshe Rabbeinu to Rav Asher, the end of the Talmud Bavli, or at least the end of the Moraim. It's not technically true to say that's the end of the Talmud Bavli, but that's another discussion. And then he does the same thing the other way, from Rav Asher backwards. This one learned from this, and he was the Talmud of so-and-so, going back in time. And then he goes on to sum up what he has presented to us, and he says, therefore, all the things that we find in the Mishnah, in the Tosefta, in the Midrashei Halacha, in the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud Yerushalmi, this is the sum total and the summary of all the discussions that these Chachamim had over many generations, and it's all summed up for us in this Talmud, or in the Mishnah, the Talmudim, and all these different works. And therefore, the Rambam goes on to say, and therefore, we are all required to listen to follow what Chazal have to say, and he specifically mentions actually the Talmud Bavli, which is something I'll have to deal with in a moment. But first, he wants to lay down the basic notion that there is something special about Chazal. And we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is it that's special about them? Because it's not the fact that they had smicha, because not all of Chazal had smicha. In other words, all the Chachamim in Bavel, for example, they don't have smicha. In fact, the greatest of them were not even referred to as Rav. For instance, Shmuel, the famous Amorah Shmuel, he was just called Shmuel. He was certainly not musmach in the sense he don't receive smicha from Samuchim. He wasn't in Eretz Yisrael, he wasn't a member of the Sanhedrin. So we're talking about a non-Sanhedrin group of people. What exactly is their source of legitimacy and authority? In order to understand this correctly, we also have to look at what Rambam himself writes elsewhere. Rambam writes in Ilchot Mamrim, where he discusses the Sanhedrin and the authority of the Sanhedrin, he explains that, and this is based on the statement of the Mishnah, that the Torah She'Ba'al Peh is what the Sanhedrin says it is. It's very simple. What the Halacha is what the Sanhedrin says it is. And they are the true and only arbiters of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And their authority and powers must be accepted by all of Am Yisrael. Which of course leads us immediately to ask the simple question, all right, if that's the source, if the source of Halacha is the Beit Din HaGadol, the Sanhedrin, that's what he says in Hilchot Mamrim. And over here in the Hakdama, he said that the source of Halacha is what it says in the Mishnah and the Talmud, much of which has nothing to do with any active Sanhedrin. Then how is that also legitimate? How is that also authoritative? Is either the source of authority is the Sanhedrin, a living Beit Din, which is before us, and then you would expect that the answer is that once there is no such Beit Din in existence, then really there's no one else to follow. There's no authoritative voice in the world of Torah. And then he tells you, no, but really the Mishnah and the Talmud are the authoritative voice of Chazal, and you have to follow what they say. And you shouldn't think that I'm asking an idle question, because there are many people who've asked this question. Many people have been perturbed by this apparent contradiction, but really, I believe there's absolutely no contradiction. In Hilchot Mamrim, the Rambam explains how the Torah and how Am Yisrael are supposed to work when all things are as they should be. In other words, when Am Yisrael is living in its land and it has a proper form of Jewish government and there's a Beit Din HaGadol in Yerushalmi, etc., they are the true source and the final authority in all Torah matters. And that's how things should be. That's why the Rambam lays this out so clearly in Hilchot Mamrim and elsewhere also, in Hilchot Sanhedrin. The word Mamrim refers to excuse me. The word Mamrim refers to the concept of a Zaken Mamre. Mamre is a Zaken is a Chacham, a sage, who openly, publicly disagrees with the Sanhedrin. He's a person who's a sage in his own right, is allowed to think that the Sanhedrin, the Beit Din HaGadol, is in error, made a mistake. Human beings can make mistakes. Even the Beit Din HaGadol can make a mistake. And if he's convinced of that fact, he may think so. And he even may tell people that I think they're mistaken, but he may not tell them, you therefore don't listen to what they said to do, you listen to what I'm telling you to do. That's called a Zaken Mamre. So the Mamrim refers to those who oppose or publicly disagree and instruct people to differ from what the Sanhedrin teaches. So as I said, that's how things should be in a perfect world or a near perfect world. And if that's all that we knew about the way Torah works, then we would all be, none of us would be here right now, because there would be no Jewish people and there would be no Judaism. Because as soon as the Sanhedrin ceased to function, as soon as the Romans, the Byzantines, shut down the Sanhedrin, the Beit Din HaGadol, the mid or the end of the 4th century, according to the Christian calendar, from that time there has not been a Beit Din HaGadol. There has not been such a central authority, and the whole concept of smicha, of the true ordination of Chachamim in the Jewish world, ceased to be. In other words, that would have spelled the end of Jewish existence and the development of Jewish law and practice for all time. But of course that can't be allowed to be. So there has to be a fallback system. There has to be, so that's lechatchila, how things should be. There has to be a b'di'avad method of dealing with reality. The b'di'avad way of dealing with reality is the Mishnah and the Talmud. In other words, let's ask the question again. We asked before, why do you have to listen to the Chazal? Why do you have to listen to the Beit Din HaGadol? What do they know? Who gave them their authority? Well, the Torah gave them authority. The Torah speaks about such a body. But obviously you have to ask, what do they know? What are their qualifications? Their qualifications are the fact that these people are steeped in Torah, have delved into the Torah all their lives, and received authentic traditions in terms of how to understand and approach the Torah, how to deal with different kinds of situations, how to interpret different aspects of the Torah. When you have a collection of such people who discuss matters amongst themselves and either reach a consensus or, if not, vote on something and go by the majority opinion, logic dictates that you have the best possible human resource, apart from a direct communication from Hashem. And anyhow, halacha doesn't work that way. Prophets are not posek halacha. Then such a collection of people must be the best people, the best address to turn to. Who else could know more than these people? Understand? In the same way, maybe not exactly the same, but in a similar fashion, if a person has a serious medical condition which requires this or that kind of treatment, or there's a couple of options how to deal with this issue, the more serious the issue, the more life-threatening, and the more delicate, the more unusual, the more rare, the person's going to want to consult with the best possible medical authorities. And I don't know if there are such things today, some kind of council of doctors or professors that get together to discuss these things, but I think sometimes in hospitals and certain departments they have such meetings of the minds of the heads of departments or the heads of a field, and they do exactly that. A person in that situation is going to want to go not to a junior doctor, but to a senior doctor, someone who's been doing this for decades and has a great name, is known for being an expert in the field, and that's what he will do because he wants to be well. And that's, of course, the correct and logical thing to do. And it's also, for a similar reason, the correct and logical and correct thing to do when it comes to Torah. You want to turn to those who are most likely, based on reason and experience and everything that we were able to ascertain, that these people are the experts. They're the biggest experts in the field. The Beit Din HaGadol are supposedly, normally that's how it should be, the biggest experts in the field of Torah. When you have no, when you have no Beit Din to turn to, you have something to fall back on, and that is the Mishnah, the Talmud. Why? Because just as the Sanhedrin or Beit Din is a collection of people who can gather and discuss things and hear different points of view and work things through, and argue from different perspectives. In the same way, we have exactly that kind of discussion in the Talmud. In the Talmud, you have the record, or the records of, we have the records of the discussions of that caliber of chachamim, of sages, who over many generations discuss many, many different aspects of Torah, and their argumentation and their proofs and the logic they brought to bear and their traditions, etc., all recorded there for us. So when you haven't got the living, the original article in front of you, you've got at least a record of the last period in history when almost all the Chachamim in Am Yisrael were more or less in one or two geographical locations. What were those locations? Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. In Eretz Yisrael you had a great center of Torah study for centuries, from the period of the beginning, or a bit later, the beginning of the Second Temple period, all the way up to the time of the Mishnah and beyond, in fact, for at least a couple of centuries beyond that time. And in Bavel, the center of Torah scholarship and study there got off the ground later, but over time it grew in size, in quality and quantity, and eventually the historical scales tipped in favor of the center of Torah, the Torah center in Bavel. In other words, if you were to go back in time to the period of Second Temple, or let's say 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, there's no question that Eretz Yisrael was up here and Bavel was down here. We see this in the Mishnah. The Mishnah Masechet Gittin talks about how few Torah scholars there are in Bavel and what have you, that sort of thing. We know that that time Eretz Yisrael was the center of Torah knowledge and study and learning, and Bavel was way down here. And over time, and it was a very slow evolutionary process, the scales began to tip. More and more people from Bavel came to Eretz Yisrael to study and took back to Bavel what they had studied, what they had learned. We mentioned Shmuel before. Shmuel was such a person. They were talking about the late 2nd, early 3rd century. There were many such people who came to Eretz Yisrael to study and took back their knowledge and wisdom to Bavel. And over time, great yeshivot academies developed. And over time, because also of the destruction in Eretz Yisrael, then which was followed 60 plus years later by the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was a huge trauma for the entire Jewish people and almost the death knell for Jewish existence in Eretz Yisrael. Over time, as I said, the scales tipped, and around the time of around the mid 4th century, the situation more or less equalized. And at that time, you still had 2 Torah centers, which there was also some friction between them. That happens in human affairs, and they were also roughly equal in authority. And as history continued, things began to tip further and further in favor of the center in Bavel. Why? Because in Bavel, the Jews were, as a rule, not being persecuted. They enjoyed religious freedom. The yeshivot were able to flourish. There was a huge population of Jews who were centered in certain areas. And you had a huge number of chachamim that grew up in that part of the world, in what we call Bavel, Persia. In Eretz Yisrael, at the same time, things were actually going downhill, because once the Roman Empire, or that part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, became Christian, they became, shall we say, extremely motivated to oppress the Jews and their religion. They wanted essentially to eradicate Judaism. And that's why they shut down the Beit Din HaGadol, the Sanhedrin, and things became more and more difficult, and in fact almost impossible for Jews in Eretz Yisrael, which is why over time more and more Jews left, and yeshivot eventually basically shut down. And so if we move forward to the period of the 8th and 9th centuries, by that time the real center of Jewish study and authority in the world is the only one really left truly functional operational mode is the one in Bavel. And that, by the way, is the real reason, and the only real reason, why the Talmud Bavli gained the position that eventually it received in the eyes of the Jewish people, because from that time onwards, the eyes of the entire Jewish world were directed towards the Torah center of learning in Bavel, and the Talmud, which is a record of what was going on there. And all Jews who had questions and queries and needed things resolved for them, etc., would turn to the Geonim, that is to say, the heads of the yeshivot in Bavel. At that time in Eretz Yisrael, there was no one to turn to, or very few and not very well-known people. There wasn't much to be done. There was no one to write to and receive answers from. And this situation continued to deteriorate until the First Crusade, which began in the year 1095. After the First Crusade, as we mentioned before, they were very motivated to do away with Jews, and the few Jews that were left, and the few Chachamim that were left in Eretz Yisrael by this time, if they weren't killed by the Crusaders, they had to flee. And that was really the beginning of the end of Jewish settlement and Jewish learning in Eretz Yisrael for quite some time. It wasn't an absolute black and white situation. It wasn't as if all the Jews disappeared and there was no one left, but the situation was very dire. And therefore, when you, imagine you have a football field with 2 fields. As long as there are two teams, as long as you have 2 teams, you have a match, you have a competition. But if one team is removed from the playing field, it's obvious who's going to win. The Babylonian team won because there was no one, there was no opposition, there was no competition. So what I've just explained to you should provide a basis and understanding why it is that we listen to Chazal and why we follow what we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud. The answer, therefore, again I repeat, is that these people are the experts. There's no one else to turn to. These are the best authorities, the biggest experts on the subject. They're the ones who know the Torah inside and out. They're the ones who receive the traditions and the approach to Torah which is necessary to make sense of it and to apply it in the real world. And therefore, if we don't have a Beit Din HaGadol, we have to turn to the Talmud and the Mishnah and all the other works that we have from Chazal, because they are the best possible source of authority. But as my teacher, Rav Yosef Gaffer Zatzal, said to me once, when I asked him, B'ezrat Hashem, when there is a Beit Din HaGadol, will we listen to the Beit Din HaGadol or to the Gemara? He said, obviously we listen to the Beit Din HaGadol, because that supersedes the Talmud. The Talmud is therefore a substitute. That is the thing to understand. The Talmud, the Mishnah, these are a substitute for a living Beit Din. But when you have that reality once again reconstituted, then obviously you revert to lechatchila mode, and you don't continue in the b'diavad mode. And what I've explained to you now, also the historical development of the two Torah centers and how over time Bavel became the only Torah center really. This also explains to you why the Talmud Bavli over time became the standard book of Halacha for the Jewish people. It's not for any of the reasons mentioned in certain sources. The Rif, for example, the end of Masechet Eruvin, says that we follow the Talmud Bavli over the Talmud Yerushalmi because the Talmud Bavli was redacted later than Talmud Yerushalmi, and they already saw everything that was written in Talmud Yerushalmi. We know today that's not true. We know today that the Talmud Bavli, for example, discusses many questions and doesn't have a clear answer for some of those questions, when the same thing is asked and answered very clearly in the Talmud Yerushalmi. They never saw what it said over there. The claim that they knew everything it says in the Talmud Yerushalmi is simply spurious. But the Rif was trying to answer a question, which is, why do we choose this Talmud A over Talmud B? So he offered a response, but I'm saying, unfortunately, this is not the correct answer. The true answer is that, to put it bluntly, it was Vespasian and Hadrian, and then the Byzantines, and then the Muslims, the Arab conquest of Eretz Yisrael, etc., that were posek, as it were, that the Talmud Bavli should become the standard book of Halacha for the Jewish people. In other words, it's an historical development. It has nothing to do with any kind of Torah principle or philosophical notion. It's a simple fact of Jewish history. If that is the case, and I'm convinced this is the case, and by the way, I'm not the first person to suggest this. Everything I've just said to you essentially was written many years ago, roughly in the it was published first in Tafshin Aleph, I think 1941, by Harav Professor Levi Ginsburg. You may or may not know the name, but it doesn't matter right now. In his introduction to his writings on the Talmud Yerushalmi, which were the first volume of which was published in that year, he basically goes through all these historical facts I just explained now, and he also therefore concludes, as we just said, that the reason the Talmud Bavli enjoys the status that it enjoys as opposed to the Talmud Yerushalmi is not for any, as we said, any cogent Torah reasoning or explanation that one could offer, is entirely a result of the vagaries of Jewish history and what different nations and empires did to us over time, and how this affected the way the Jewish world developed, and how people had to live and to whom they had to turn in order to continue being Jews and asking the right questions and getting the right answers. Question?
Yes. My first question is, what are the preconditions for the Beit Din HaGadol being reestablished? And my second question is, how does one become a member?
All right. Before I answer your question, I just want to conclude the previous thought by saying that if it is the case that the Talmud Bavli became the standard halachic work at the expense of the Talmud Yerushalmi, for the reasons we explained, it follows, in my mind at least, that it doesn't always have to remain so. If it's, as the Reef suggests, that this one came after that one, and therefore they saw all those arguments and decided not to accept them, then there would be no basis to claim that now things should change, if that argument was a cogent and historically accurate argument. But I don't think it is for one moment. By the way, neither did the Rambam. I should mention the Rambam obviously knew what the Reef wrote a long time before himself, and yet he doesn't mention that. He gives another reason why the Talmud Bavli is accepted more than anything else. But I don't want to sidetrack right now with that. So I'm saying if the reason for the Talmud Bavli's ascendance is an historical one and not an essentially Jewish or Torah one, therefore that doesn't have to always be so. Things can change. In other words, I believe that today and from here on in, the Jewish people are in a position to, first of all, approximately at least half of the Jewish people are today in Eretz Yisrael, and that percentage will only rise over time for obvious reasons. And this is a new historical reality that has not existed since, well, very possibly since the First Temple period, but certainly. And even if it existed for a time during the Second Temple period, it was only very brief. So this is a brand new reality. The Jewish people are centered today in Eretz Yisrael, will continue to be so. And we find ourselves in a situation, this by the way is really the beginning of my answer to your question. Because you could also ask, before you ask how you become a member, you could ask why do we need it, or what's wrong with the present situation. The problem with the present situation is that rather than acting and thinking as a united Jewish nation with a national agenda and purpose, at this point the Jewish world, certainly the religious world, is still thinking in terms of scattered Jewish communities who find themselves all over the globe, essentially not really in touch with other members of the Jewish nation, each doing their own thing. So people identify, most people, Jewish religious people nowadays identify as Ashkenazi Jews or Sfaradi or Temani or something else. And essentially each of these communities, each of these divisions within the Jewish people, without expressly saying so, and without very often even thinking about what they're doing and why they're doing it, they see their purpose as maintaining and continuing that which was done 1, 2, 3, 4, or 10 generations ago. So if you're a Sfaradi Jew from Morocco, so your purpose is to continue a Moroccan version of Halachic Judaism here in Kiryat Ono. And if you happen to be of Hungarian Ashkenazi extraction, so your purpose is to continue doing what your great-grandfather did in this or that town in Hungary or Romania, what have you. In other words, people are, and not just people, when I say people I mean Rabbanim, I mean the Torah world, I mean yeshivot, I mean the entire establishment, essentially, the religious establishment, thinks of itself, views itself as a continuation of that which was in the Galut. And many parts of the Jewish world, in fact, yearn for that Galut. And this is a very simple proposition to prove. I live in Givat Shaul, and from my home, if you look to the northwest, you can see the what is today a very large neighborhood of Ramot, correct? And one of the first sections of Ramot that was built way back in the 70s was called Ramat Polin. That's a very interesting thought, don't you think? Jews were living in Poland for at least 1,000 years, praying every day that they would not be in Poland, but they would rather be in Yerushalmi. And when some of their descendants actually make it to Yerushalmi, they feel impelled to name their neighborhood Ramat Polin, Poland Heights. All right, well, that never really sat well with me, but it does speak volumes about the mindset of the people who live in that neighborhood, and the people who live in that neighborhood are hardcore Hasidic Jews. And they're essentially, psychologically, intellectually speaking, they are living in Minsk, Dvinsk or Pinsk or whatever other part of Eastern Europe their families, their ancestors came from. That's where they are. Physically they're elsewhere, but that's where they are in everything, in terms of everything that matters, that's where they are. And they not only do they not know how to get out of that mental place, they don't want to get out of that mental place. They're quite happy where they are. I, for one, am not happy in being in such a place, and I don't feel myself to be in such a place. And I don't believe that the Torah wants us to feel that we are obligated to feel and to think and to live our lives here in Eretz Yisrael based on that model or that mode of thinking or that mindset. Therefore, if that's our aim and that's our aspiration, then we have to ask ourselves, how do we break out of that mold? And this brings me back to what I said before, what I began with. The essence of Halacha, the basis of the Torah Shebaal Peh is what we find in Chazal, in the Mishnah, and the Talmud, etc. Everything else is of a lower level of importance. Not to say it's irrelevant and unimportant, but it's not binding in the same way, and it's therefore open to discussion. And I believe that the Rambam, for example, understood this. Therefore, the Rambam discusses in relatively few places does he speak about minhagim. He uses the word minhag or nohagim or something like that much less frequently than many other halachic codes, because he understood that there's no purpose talking about what people in this part of the world do, what their custom is, and what their custom is over there, as you find in the Torah, for example. He discusses what the Minhag of Jews in Spain is as opposed to the Minhag of Jews in Germany, because the Rambam understands that one day there'll be no more Jews in Germany, and there'll be no more Jews in Spain, and everyone's going to come back to Eretz Yisrael. So we don't need to record for all time what was going on in Toledo or in Frankfurt, because one day that's no longer going to be of central importance to us. So he minimizes his discussion of such things and concentrates on the essentials of Torah Judaism. And therefore the Rambam's summary of Torah, of Halacha, the Mishneh Torah, is one of the best places for us to start when we wish to redefine and reformulate the Torah Shebaal Peh, not for a community of Jews living in this or that country, but for a Jewish nation that is returning to its land. And therefore we need a Beit Din Gadol. First of all, we need it because the Torah says we need it. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to establish a Beit Din Gadol, to have a central halachic Torah authority. That is mitzvah aseh in the Torah. On top of that, logic dictates, as we just discussed now, that we need such a body to do what we said, to reformulate, to begin to lead us along a path that will allow us to reconstitute the Jewish nation and cease being a collection of Jews from scattered communities who happen to find themselves together in the same piece of real estate right now, which is how we're functioning at the moment. Therefore, we can't really have a national agenda because we're not thinking in terms of a nation. We're thinking of continuing in the ways of our grandfathers, which is on the one hand very wonderful. We should want to continue the traditions and the Torah of our grandfathers, but that cannot come at the expense of reconstituting the Jewish nation and redefining our purpose as a Jewish nation, which is what the Torah itself wants from us. Because the Torah, when the Torah was given to us, the Torah itself describes what Hashem said to Moshe Rabbeinu, what he was told to tell the Jewish people. Why am I giving you this Torah? What did he say? He said, "Va'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'roy kadosh." You shall be, for my purpose. That's how I translate it. Li atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim, a nation of unique people with a special purpose, like a priest who is a unique and a elevated individual with a special purpose. You will be a nation of special, unique people and a holy nation. In other words, the Torah is telling us your purpose is to be a nation. Where, obviously, in Eretz Yisrael, the Torah says that about 1,000 times. Our purpose, therefore, is to be a nation here in Eretz Yisrael and live according to the Torah. That's the bottom line of Judaism. everything else, therefore, has to take a back seat to that essential purpose of the Torah itself. And therefore, anything that gets in the way of that essential and overriding purpose of the Torah has to be re-examined, and if necessary, jettisoned. I'll give you an example of something of an example to describe what I'm discussing. Many years ago, on a Friday night, I went to a Shalom Zachar. You probably know what a Shalom Zachar is. Someone had a baby boy, and they throw a little kiddush type of event in their home after the meal on Friday night. I went along, and I met this young man from America. He was probably 17 years old. He'd come to Israel to study in yeshiva from a more Haredi background, although he wasn't dressed in real Haredi garb, so I don't know how Haredi he really was, but that kind of background more or less. And we got talking, and somehow we got onto the subject of how to pronounce Hebrew correctly. I don't know now, I don't recall how we got onto this. This is 25 plus years ago, so don't ask for all the details. We discussed it, and I went through the whole issue of, the alphabet, went through the letters and told him how, as far as I know, they should be pronounced correctly. And the vowels, I gave him the whole spiel. And he listened very intently, and at the end of which he said to me, that's very, very interesting. And you also, the truth is you've convinced me. Everything you said made sense, and you brought proof for everything you said. So I'm sure you're right. So I said, wonderful. And I assume, therefore, that you'll start implementing this, or trying to learn it at least, in your davening, in your learning. He said, no, I wish I could, but I can't do that. I said, why not? He said, because according to Halacha, I have to pronounce Hebrew the way my grandfather pronounced Hebrew. So I thought about that for a moment. I said to him, what you're saying is that the Halacha directs you to mispronounce Hebrew rather than, in other words, it's more important that you follow in the footsteps of your grandfather in terms of the way he pronounced it, even though he didn't really know how it should be pronounced necessarily. That's more important than the truth of the matter. How's the Hebrew language really supposed to be pronounced? In other words, halacha and truth are at loggerheads. They don't work together. They work at cross purposes. And I said to him, that's a very strange understanding of halacha. My understanding of halacha, I said to him, is that the halacha is there to show us the way and to train us how to live according to the Torah in the real world, and how to implement the Torah shebichtav and sheba'al peh in the real world according to the truth of the Torah, but not that it should force us to do that which we know to be incorrect because that happens to be the way my grandfather did it. That doesn't make any sense to me. In the same way, we cannot continue, I don't think we're in fact, I don't think it's permissible for us to continue acting in such a way that negates the concept of reconstituting the Jewish nation that we spoke of, being a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. Because again, that is the overriding purpose, the bottom line of the Torah, and therefore other considerations have to be viewed as less central and less important if they get in the way of achieving that purpose. And therefore, continuing living as Ashkenazim or Sfaradim and using the different halachic systems and systems of Minhagim that these different communities had in order to define who we are and what we do and how we do things on a daily basis and what we pass on to our children, if that gets in the way of the real aim of the Torah, being a goy kadosh, of redefining ourselves and recreating the Jewish nation here in Eretz Yisrael, then that is a skewed and misconceived halachic system, and therefore we have to come up with, and it's not impossible. If you want to discuss that, we will. How one does that, but it's not at all beyond our ken, and it's not beyond our capabilities to reconstitute and reformulate an halachic system based on entirely authentic and authoritative sources of Chazal and major Rishonim like the Rambam, to develop an halachic system which will allow and facilitate the reconstitution and redefinition of the Jewish people as a nation rather than a collection of scattered communities. That's the first part of the discussion. I don't know how much more time we have and what else you want to hear. Question?
Out of my ignorance, how different, two things. First of all, how different are the Bavli and the Yerushalmi? And second of all, the Rambam, how much did he take from the Yerushalmi as opposed to from the Bavli?
The Talmud, Bavli, and Yerushalmi are very different. In style, in language, in length.
I mean, more in terms of halacha.
Yeah. And in halachic decisions also. There are many significant differences between them. Also, perhaps even more significant, is a difference in approach, how to analyze the earlier sources, such as the Mishnah and Baraitoth, etc. The Talmud Bavli takes a much more convoluted approach, whereas the Talmud Yerushalmi is much more straightforward. Its argumentation is much more concise and much simpler to follow. In fact, people very often say the Talmud Yerushalmi is much harder to learn. That's only because they're not used to the language and the style. Once you get used to that, it's actually it's much easier. So they are rather different. That's number one. Number two, you ask about the Rambam. There's no question the Rambam was fully conversant with the Talmud Yerushalmi as with the Talmud Bavli. We see this from many sources. He definitely took it into account in many places, but it's also true that he was also a product of a system and a school of thought which he had inherited from his father, Rabbi Maimun. That's the correct pronunciation, by the way, of the name, not Maimon, but Maimun. And his father was a Talmud of Rabbi Yosef ibn Migash, who was a Talmud of the Rif. And the Rif was a Talmud of Rabbi Hanarel, was a Talmud of Rabbi Gaon. So it's a long tradition that goes back at least a couple of centuries. And that tradition is essentially a Bavli tradition, a Babylonian tradition. So he did not break out of the mold altogether, but it's true that given those facts, he did stretch the halachic material as more or less as far as he thought he could, where he thought it was necessary. So we do find occasionally the Rambam bases himself on Yerushalmi as opposed to the Bavli, but not, as is sometimes claimed, as a very frequent occurrence. It's not that frequent, but it's there in the background. Yes.
Can you address maybe more fully the Rambam's approach to Bavli, why he thought it was authoritative, and why you think that approach is not applicable necessarily for our time?
All right, well, the Rambam, as I said before, did not agree with the Rif. The Rif, who came before the Rambam, said we have to accept the Bavli over the Yerushalmi because the Bavli saw the Yerushalmi, and if it disagrees, it means it's rejected what it saw in the Yerushalmi, and therefore, and it's a later book, a system that came later that saw the original and disagreed with it, and therefore we have to follow the latter authority. And I explained why this is, for one reason at least, why this is not true. The Rambam also apparently was not very impressed with this line of thinking because he doesn't quote this. When he has to answer the question, why do you have to follow the Talmud Bavli, he basically says as follows. After he explained how the true traditions and understandings of Torah were known to this collection of people, of a multi-generational collection of people called Chazal, whose discussions and understandings are recorded for us in the works of Chazal that we have before us. He says that all of the Jewish people have to accept the Talmud Bavli, we all have to accept the Talmud Bavli because the Jewish people accepted it upon themselves. That's what he says. And that's also an interesting notion, because first of all, where in the Torah do you find the idea that if the Jewish people accept something upon themselves that is halachically binding? Where is that written? I have no idea, because I've never seen such a thing. And I don't think the Rambam ever saw such a thing, so I don't know why, but that's what he writes. The reason he wrote this is obviously because he, as we already explained, he was already dealing with a situation. We're talking about the Rambam who was living in the 12th century. he was really living in a world where the Talmud Bavli had won, where the Talmud Bavli was the standard source of halacha, and as I've said, that's the tradition he received from his forefathers and his teachers. He was not in a position to reject that reality out of hand. He also probably didn't feel it was necessary or correct to do so. And he couched it somewhat unusually, I think. It's a bit surprising, because the Rambam doesn't usually say things which cannot be explained, or for which one cannot bring some basis. And here, this is a statement without any clear basis. He says that because the Jewish people accepted it, therefore it's binding. I can tell you that for once upon a time I heard a certain shiur by a certain Rav. I heard on the radio, it was a recording. And this Rav was explaining why the Jewish people have to accept what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. And his line of reasoning was very simple, and it was as follows. He said, as the Rambam writes in his Hakdama to Mishneh Torah, the Jewish people have to accept the Talmud Bavli because everyone has to follow the Talmud Bavli because the Jewish people accepted it upon themselves. Therefore, the Jewish people accepted upon themselves the Shulchan Aruch, therefore we all have to follow it. That was his line of reasoning. I reject that line of reasoning altogether for a number of reasons. First of all, the Rambam did not just come up with the statement that we all have to follow the Talmud Bavli because the Jewish people at some point in history accepted it. He didn't just say that out of context. He said that at the end of a very long discussion in which or explanation and presentation in which he had shown that the information that one finds in the Talmud Bavli, which includes the Mishnah, is the redaction and the summary of the words of wisdom and the teachings and the traditions of all the Chachamim for many, many generations going back in time. In other words, it's not as if some unknown quantity sat down one day, wrote a book called the Talmud Bavli, and asked all the Jews, would you like to accept it? And they all said, yeah, you know what, it's a great idea, we'll accept it. And that's it, that's how it becomes authoritative. That's not what happened. The Rambam says this book is the summary of the opinions and discussions and conclusions of the finest Torah minds and the greatest experts in the field over hundreds of years, all laid out before you. And without saying so, it's obvious the Rambam says, and therefore the Jewish people accepted it. The Jewish people didn't just accept something because it was there or because nobody wrote it, but because they knew that these people whose views are recorded here are to be followed, because they're the people that you must logically, rationally, you must follow. You must listen to. There's no one else better to follow. You cannot say the same thing about the Shulchan Aruch, for example, because the Shulchan Aruch is one book of Jewish law, and there are many other books of Jewish law. There's the Shulchan Aruch, and there's the Torah, and there's the Rambam, and there's the Piskei Arid, and there's, I could go on almost ad infinitum. There are many, many codes and books that discuss Halacha and Jewish law. And if you want to explain, if you want to know why the Jewish people, as it were, accepted the Shulchan Aruch, my answer to you is very simple. There's such a thing never happened. No one accepted the Shulchan Aruch. That's a fiction. And in fact, the same is true. What I'm about to tell about the Shulchan Aruch is also true if you go back in time 1,000 years before to the time of the Talmud Bavli. Let me explain to you what happened to the Shulchan Aruch. In the 16th century, Rabbi Yosef Kara, who was a Sfaradi, wrote a book called the Shulchan Aruch, after he'd written many other works of Halacha. Prior to that, his Perush on the Torah, the Beth Yosef, and what have you, many other works. And he summed up the halachic discussions that he wrote in those different works, those prior works in the Shulchan Aruch. For reasons that he explains in his introduction, he chose to take 3 Rishonim from amongst many, many Rishonim, let's say 20 or 30 in number. He chose 3, Rambam, Rif, and the Rosh, and he said, I will follow the majority of the 2 out of 3. If there's a disagreement, I'll go with the majority, and that's when I'll lay down as the halacha. There's 2 problems with that. First of all, it's not what he does a lot of the time. I can show you tens of places, maybe hundreds of places where clearly the Shulchan Aruch is saying something which either none of those three agreed with, or one of them agreed with and the other two did not agree with. So he doesn't really follow his own rule of thumb. But a better question is, where did he come up with this rule of thumb in the first place? Whoever heard of such a thing? And it is something new, a newfangled idea, because the fact is the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who later wrote his additional commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and he was an Ashkenazi, and therefore created a new book altogether by adding his annotations. He himself writes, in his introduction, he says, where did he get this idea from, choose these three as opposed to everybody else? The answer to that question is very simple. The Beit Yosef did not really set himself the task of deciding the halacha on every issue from scratch. That's not what he did. Essentially, we have a gentleman here with a camera. Essentially, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and don't misunderstand me, I don't mean to denigrate him, chas v'shalom, in any way, but essentially he was first and foremost a photographer. He took halachic snapshots of the reality in the Sephardi world as it was at that time. He himself came of a Spanish background and then later in Turkey, and he was certainly a Sephardi, and he knew what the Sephardi Jews had been doing for centuries and what their traditions and practices were, and that's what he wrote down in his books, in the Shulchan Aruch, for example. And the fact of the matter is that centuries before the Beit Yosef, before Rabbi Yosef Karo, it had become the de facto reality and system, halachic system of the Sephardi Jews, that their halachic practice was largely based on the Rif and the Rambam. So if the Beit Yosef comes along and says, I'm going to write a book based on the Rif and the Rambam, largely, and they usually agree, by the way, so the Rosh is always almost always at a disadvantage to begin, before you even begin, then he hasn't really said anything very new, because all he's saying is, I'm going to write down what my forefathers have been doing for centuries. And that's the reality. The Sephardi Jewish world was essentially walking in the footsteps of the Rif and the Rambam for centuries prior to the Shulchan Aruch. And he basically just wrote it down in a book and codified what was already in existence for many generations. And Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Rama, who lived in Poland at the same time, did exactly the same thing for the Ashkenazim. And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch, if it wasn't for the Rama, who was in Poland, the book written by the Beit Yosef in Tzfat would never have become the bestseller and the source of authority that it became. Because for the majority of the Jewish world, which by that time, 500 years ago, was Ashkenazi, the majority of the Jews were Ashkenazim, for the majority of the Jews, the Shulchan Aruch was something which they could not possibly accept or work with, because it disagreed with their accepted practice right, left, and center. As the Rama himself writes in his introductions, we can't work with this book because we usually follow not the Rif and the Rambam, we usually follow the Tosafot and the Rosh and Marami Rothenburg and the Mordechai. So this book doesn't work for us. But what I can do, he says, wherever what the Rabbi Yosef Karo writes disagrees with what we are used to doing, the way we do things, I'll write it down. I'll make a note that we don't do this, we don't do A, we do B. That turned it into a book that all Jews could live with. Why? Because there was nothing new here. Rabbi Yosef Karo just wrote down in words that which the Sephardim had been doing for generations, and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Rama, did exactly the same thing for the Ashkenazim. He just wrote down, or took halachic snapshots of what the Ashkenazim had been doing for centuries, following those poskim. Why did they follow those and the other ones follow those? Very simple. Those were the local chachamim in their part of the world, in North Africa, in Spain, etc. And these were the local chachamim, the Tosafot, Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi, these were the local chachamim in Western Europe. As is normal, everyone follows the rabbanim that they know. Who is going to disagree with a book that just tells you what you already know? That this is what we do. If that's what you do, so okay, so I'll continue doing it. Thank you for letting me know, but I knew that anyhow, more or less. And okay, fine. So that's for your Sfaradim, you wrote down A. For Ashkenazim, you've written down B. This book is now something that all Jews can feel comfortable with. Why shouldn't it become a bestseller? Why shouldn't it be accepted by everyone? It's not that it was accepted by anyone. It's not as if anyone asked anybody. There was no vote about it. There's no referendum. It was just a book that works because it gives you both sides of the Jewish coin, and all the different communities can find themselves within that book. And therefore, it is more a a series of halachic snapshots. It's showing us, depicting a certain halachic reality that existed generations before that time in different parts of the Jewish world, and therefore was a book that everyone could live with. Just one more moment. If we go back 1,000 years to the Talmud Bavli, and the Rambam there, you asked about the Rambam. The Rambam says we all have to follow the Talmud Bavli because the Jewish people, all of Am Yisrael, accepted it. Well, it's exactly the same thing I just explained about the Shulchan Aruch. By the time the Rambam is writing this in the 12th century, most of the Jews in the world have been living according to the Talmud Bavli for a few centuries already because of the historical process that we described, and therefore it's true to say the Jewish people accepted, but it's not really true. No one accepted. In other words, there was no discussion, should we accept it, shouldn't we accept it. It was just a reality. Bavel was the center of Torah knowledge in the world. The Talmud Bavli was the book that summed up the Torah wisdom of Bavel, and that's what the Jewish people were familiar with, and therefore they followed it. So it's not as if the Jews had an option, or someone discussed it, or if the different communities set up a ballot box and everyone voted on the question. No, it was just the reality that developed over time. And therefore, in the same way that Talmud Bavli was not accepted, but rather it became, due to historical processes and realities, it became the standard book of Halacha. In the same way, the Shulchan Aruch became the standard book because it described the reality that was already pre-existent. Yeah.
Could you say something about today's practices in Israel and how modern movements like the national religious Orthodox Judaism, and also maybe fast-growing groups like Chabad and Breslov, Hasidei Breslov, that have integrated and brought in both Ashkenazi and Sephardic adherents together, how they've tackled this challenge to try to
Which challenge?
To work with both traditions at the same time, the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi traditions, and at the same time try to work within one system.
I'm not sure I actually understand what you're asking, or how the way you formulate it.
For instance, I've mistaken an attempt in certain times in national religious, under Rav Kook and maybe afterwards, there were ideas that they should have a nusach achid and a tefillot, and there was some.
Goren, I think, tried.
Goren.
Let me start with what you just mentioned, nusach achid. This was an attempt, and I'm sorry to have to say, a very clumsy attempt by Hagaon Hagadol Rav Shlomo Goren Zitzal to suggest some nusach tefillah that everyone would accept. But of course, we all know the fact of the matter is no one accepted it at all. No one. And the answer, and the reason for that is very simple, because it's not an organic new nusach that everyone can view as something new, which I will accept this new nusach. Nusach achid is nusach Sfarad, which is nusach Ashkenaz. So if you want, I'll give you the history of nusach Sfarad in 3 sentences also. Nusach Ashkenaz is an ancient nusach that's been around for at least 800 years, as it is today, with almost close to no change. 200 years ago, some Hasidim took nusach Ashkenaz, which all Ashkenazim had been davening for centuries, and began to fiddle with it and make changes to it, ostensibly to fit in more with the nusach they found in the writings of the Ari. And what they came up with is something called nusach Sfarad. It's a brand new nusach, basically. It's only been around 200 years. So much for Orthodox people claiming that you can't come up with a new nusach for tefillah, or therefore opposing my nusach Eretz Yisrael, because it's new. Nusach Sfarad is just as new, or it certainly was just as new 200 years ago, and it has no historical basis. And it's a clumsy nusach because it's not an organic nusach. It's a nusach that existed with all kinds of things added on. So it's just, and it's not done very well. So it's clumsy and it doesn't flow. It doesn't sit well. Rav Goren took nusach Sfarad, removed the front page where it said nusach Sfarad, and put a new front page where it said nusach achid, and said this is nusach achid, but it's also all daven this now. No one was fooled by that. Not those who daven Nusach Ashkenaz, not those who daven Nusach Sfarad, not the Sfaradim, not the Temanim. Everyone said, we're not interested in you telling us to accept this Nusach that's been around, that's an Ashkenazi Nusach basically. We all do what we want to do, what we're used to doing. The only way to have a chance of convincing Jews who are interested in such a thing, of course, to accept a new Nusach is if you come to them with something which is really new, which is not Nusach Ashkenaz, and not Nusach Sfaradi, and not Nusach Temani, and not Nusach Sfarad, but something which is really equally new and unknown to almost all Jews nowadays, and that is Nusach Eretz Yisrael. That all Jews could, those who want to at least, could say, this is something which is, I'm not taking upon myself to be a Sfaradi, if you're Ashkenazi, and a Sfaradi couldn't say it, but I'm not taking it upon myself to become more Ashkenazi. We're all becoming something more authentic, more Eretz Yisrael. That's something that I think can work and should work. That's with regards to Nusach Ahid. You mentioned the Dati Lumi world. This, I think, is a very sore point. The Dati Lumi world is basically living in denial of who they really are and what they claim they would like to be. They talk about Torah Eretz Yisrael, but they don't do anything about it. If you get up, in the month of Elul, get up in the morning in Yeshivat Mekaz Arav or any other of the well-known yeshivot of the Dati Lumi world, and see what slichot they're saying, for example, well, you'll see that most of them, if it's Mekaz Arav, where I studied, you'll see that they're all reciting slichot from a book which has on the front page, it says Minhag Polin, the Polish ritual. And in certain other shuls it might be Minhag Lita, the Lithuanian ritual, and in another Sfaradi yeshiva it might be the Sfaradi version. In other words, the Dati Lumi world, on the one hand, claims to not think the same way as the Haredi world, but in practice, by and large, they do exactly the same thing. Because to do something different would require a complete revamping of the halachic system and realigning their mindset and reassessing things, and that is something that they, as a tzibur, as a group, as a anthropological community, are not ready or not able yet to do. So and therefore the standard line amongst Dati Lu'umi Rabbanim is to tell people, if you're Ashkenazi, you continue in the Ashkenazi halachic system, and all the customs that go with it are obligatory, and they say exactly the same thing to the Sfaradim, which of course guarantees that things will continue as they have been, well, essentially for all time. In other words, how do you break that system? How do you break out of that system? If there's a halachic imperative that an Ashkenazi Jew follows Ashkenazi Psak Halacha and Ashkenazi Minhagim, and if there's a halachic imperative that a Sfaradi Jew does the same but in a Sfaradi way, then these lines constantly, well, they're diverging, or at most they're parallel, but they can't possibly converge. How can they meet? At what point will they meet when they become one people again? So again, that halachic mindset guarantees that the galut will continue to exist amongst us with no end in sight. The only way to break out of that circle is to really reassess and reformulate our halachic approach from scratch. And I can go on, I can say something more about that if you like in a moment. That is a very major undertaking, and that demands a lot of courage and vision. And I'm afraid that is lacking at this point. Everything I've just said is about the Tilumi world. The Haredi world has no such problem, because by definition they claim that things should be as they are, and they should remain as they are, and they have no aspiration that things should be at any time be any different. Everything we've been discussing is all connected to Messianism, but a healthy and authentic form of Messianism, not a form of Messianism which claims that a person who lived in Brooklyn and who died 20 years ago is the Mashiach. That's not an authentic form of Jewish messianism, not to my mind. Jewish messianism means that we have an aspiration, as we said before, to reconstitute our national existence in our homeland based on the Torah in general terms. And if that requires a reassessment and a redefinition and reformulation, well, that's what we need to do. Now, the imagery I like to use to describe this, what needs to be done, is as follows. Imagine you have a circle of bricks, a circle made up of, let's say, 10 bricks. And I come along and say to a person, I'd like you to, I have 11th brick here, which is really a lovely brick, I'd like you to add it to the circle. He has two choices. He can either say, okay, I'll add it to the circle. What does he have to do in order to do that? He can either remove one of the bricks and replace it with the new brick that I gave him, and we'll end up again with 10 bricks. So the circle has changed only in a minimal fashion, and he's also lost part of what he had before, which he may not want to do. The other thing he can do is to break the circle entirely and now build a larger circle with 11 bricks, or 12 bricks, or 13 bricks. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. If you the circle of 10 bricks is the Judaism which our forefathers were able to maintain and practice and live in the Galut, in all the different parts of the world where we were scattered. That's the circle of mitzvot and of our concepts and practices that we were able to maintain and pass down from generation to generation. When we return to Eretz Yisrael, by force of the Torah realities and the historical realities, we all of a sudden find ourselves with this system of 10 bricks, which comes from the Galut, which is therefore by definition very limited in its scope. It only deals with Galut Judaism. It doesn't deal with all aspects of Judaism, which are much wider and broader and all-encompassing than what anyone could imagine in terms of Galut Judaism. We have to add all these bricks to the circle. We don't want to throw away any part of Judaism, but we have to create a new product. And we can't replace part of the old system instead put a new bricks in their place. We can't, for instance, get rid of the brick called Shmirat Shabbat and replace it with Shemitah. That doesn't work. We have to create a new circle of bricks altogether, which means breaking the old system, the old circle, and recreating and now building a new circle. The fear that seizes the rabbinical world is the fear of having to break the circle of bricks, because then for a moment you have no circle at all. And you might be scared that you won't be able to recreate a circle, and then what do you have? But that is the fear. That is in fact, the terror that grips many people. How can we break the circle in order to build something new? We don't know how to build it, we don't know how it's supposed to look. We know this circle, we know how it works, we'll stick with what we have. But we need to, there's no way around it. We have to deal with the issue and tackle it head on, which requires that we dismantle the circle of bricks that we have, which is the Galut version of Judaism, what I refer to as Galut mode Judaism, GMJ, and replace it with, which is also GMJ, Gula mode Judaism. So as not to confuse you, so I'll call it redemption mode Judaism, so RMJ. We need to replace GMJ with RMJ, and that, for some people, is a very scary prospect, and they're not willing to do it. And therefore, Sheval Ta'aseh Adif, let's not play with the system, let's not do anything. And for whatever reason, Hashem created me in such a fashion that I don't suffer from this terror. I don't know why, but that's just how it is. And I'm not scared, because I see that we have all the sources and all the materials, and we know we can definitely recreate and reassemble this circle, a much greater and more beautiful and majestic circle than that which we had till now.
Thank you. Just before you go, we want I'd like to thank Rabbi Bar-Hayim very much, and you can look up Rabbi Bar-Hayim online, Machon Shilo. There are some very wonderful lectures, and I've learned quite a lot. And also, the Jerusalem Salon will be having another event in a month with Rabbi David Lappin. More information to follow, so keep an eye out and have a happy Hanukkah.